and I can now introduce Dr. Rachel Dellman. It's a great pleasure to do this. Rachel is currently an early career fellow, Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the University of York. She's got degrees from Nottingham University, a BA. She's got an MPhil from Cambridge and a degree from Oxford as well, her DPhil, which was funded by the AHRC and awarded in 2017. And it need be mentioned in this context as well that she was an Ox Scholar, courtesy of the BAA, and her own hard work, of course, in 2017 as well. In 2018 and 19, Rachel was the Susan Manning Fellow at the University of Edinburgh's Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities. Now, her DPhil thesis focused on the relationship between female authority and the physical and social space of great households in the later Middle Ages. And she's currently preparing a monograph for OUP on that arises from the dissertation. And I gather, Rachel, I'm not quite sure, but I gather that tonight's talk is not unconnected with that. The talk tonight is titled Women and the Built Environment in Late Medieval Scotland. Now, will people please, after Rachel's presentation, be aware that there'll be an opportunity to ask questions and put those questions in the Q&A rather than the chat box. Thank you very much indeed. Rachel.
Thank you very much for that really kind and generous introduction, Julian. I'm just going to do the fun part of the lecture where I attempt to share my screen. So hopefully you can all see that now.
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So I'd like to say thank you also to Lloyd for inviting me to speak today and to Meg for technical support. And I hope I can live up to Julian's generous introduction. And thank you all for giving up part of your evening or day, depending on where you are in the world, to attend. And I'd also like to use this opportunity just very quickly to thank the British Archaeological Association for awarding me an Ox Scholarship, as Julian said, for writing up my doctorate back in 2017, which really made it possible for me to complete my thesis. So my lecture this evening is based on work which I carried out during a brief stint in Edinburgh back in 2018, when I held the Susan Manning Fellowship at the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Edinburgh. And there I spent a thoroughly enjoyable 8 months investigating the architectural patronage of Scottish women. Now, I have to admit that this was my first encounter with Scottish history, so I'd come to this project from working on great residences headed by women in 15th and early 16th century England, and I wanted to see how some of my thoughts concerning the relationship between gender, power, and space played out in a different geographical context. During my time in Edinburgh, I thought about a number of late medieval women who were involved in various kinds of building projects, but my main focus was Mary of Gelders, who was Queen Consort of Scotland from 1449, and then who essentially acted as regent between 1460 and her death 3 years later. And so it's Mary that I plan to focus on today, and I'm going to do this by discussing 4 building projects that she was involved in during her brief stint as Dowager Queen. And those are, as you can see on the screen here, her major building projects of Trinity Kirk in Edinburgh, which you can see at the bottom there, Ravenscraig Castle at Kirkcaldy in Fife, which is just above, and then also her more minor works to Falkland Palace, which is also in Fife, and which is shown at the top of the screen, and then her additions to the fabric of the building that's now St Giles Cathedral on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, as shown in the bottom right-hand corner. And throughout this talk, I'm going to think about how Mary deployed the built environment to articulate her position and power as Queen Dowager, who ruled Scotland during her son's minority. And I'm also going to think about how, as part of this, Mary used architecture to tread the line between her natal and marital kin in order to celebrate her dual identity as a foreign-born Queen of Scotland. So first things first then, who was Mary of Gelders? On the 18th of June, 1449, 15-year-old Mary of Gelders stepped onto the shores of Leith to the northeast of Edinburgh ahead of her marriage to King James II at Holyrood Palace. Mary had been born in Gelders, which today is in Holland, in around 1434 to Catherine of Cleves and Arnold, Duke of Gelders. At the age of just 9, Mary moved to the court of her great-uncle Philip the Good and his wife Isabella of Portugal in Burgundy, where she was raised in the Duchess's household. And we'll be seeing more of Isabella later on in my paper, but it's worth saying here that the Duchess was a highly educated woman who participated in political negotiations and maintained influential networks throughout Europe. As a consequence, the young Mary received an excellent education, which likely prepared her, as Amy Hayes has argued, for her later role as the head of Scotland's government. Philip the Good and Isabella of Burgundy had no legitimate daughters of their own, and they instead used the marriages of their great nieces, Mary included, as a way of consolidating alliances across Europe. Mary was eventually destined for Scotland, and in the summer of 1449, she married King James II. The marriage was considered a success in dynastic terms. Assisted by the shirt relic of the 11th century Queen of Scots, St. Margaret, Mary gave birth to 2 surviving sons and 3 daughters. Mary's uncle, the Duke of Burgundy, certainly appears to have been pleased with the match. In 1457, he sent James Mons Meg, the famous cannon which can still be seen at Edinburgh Castle today. James's love of artillery, however, was also to be his downfall. 3 years later, in 1460, the 29-year-old king died suddenly at the siege of Roxburgh when another of his cannons exploded and killed him. Now, the nature of the evidence means that we don't know too much about Mary's actions during her marriage, but it is clear that she was particularly active in her husband's first parliament in 1450, and that she was also present at the siege of Blackness Castle in 1454, which James afterwards gave her as a gift to celebrate the Scots' victory. Charitable and pious concerns were also clearly at the forefront of her mind, as she appears to have been the driving force behind the couple's foundation of a hospital at Fale near Glasgow, and it was reportedly as a result of her influence that the first observant Franciscans arrived in Scotland. In addition to this, Mary is known to have given generously to 6 poor men who resided next to the gates of Stirling Castle. And here on the screen, we can see an image of Mary's mother, Catherine of Cleves, distributing alms to the poor, which is taken from Catherine's prayer book, and this was very likely used to educate the young Mary. Yet despite these brief glimpses into Mary's political presence and charitable concerns as consort, it's really during her widowhood that she steps out of the shadows and becomes visible to us as a shrewd political operator and as a skilled stateswoman in her own right. 5 days after James's death, Mary ordered for Roxburgh to be burned to the ground. Now a widow, she acted quickly to ensure a smooth transition of power and to protect the crown on behalf of her 8-year-old son, the future James III. Between 1460 and her death 3 years later, Mary essentially acted as regent of Scotland, governing the country during her son's minority. As a wealthy widow and Queen Dowager, Mary now had financial and political freedoms which had been unavailable to her during her marriage, and she used this opportunity to appoint her own men as keepers of vital castles, including Edinburgh, Stirling, Blackness, and Dunbar. And she also made one of her personal favourites, James Lindsay of Covington, keeper of the Privy Seal. Mary has been described by Rosalind Marshall as spectacularly successful in navigating the complex political climates of the Wars of the Roses, which were occurring down in England at this time. and she skillfully played off the rival factions of Lancaster and York to win back several border towns for the Scots, including the significant town of Berwick-upon-Tweed. It's against this context that Mary also becomes visible to us as a prolific architectural patron. In her 3 years as Queen Dowager, Mary embarked upon a substantial programme of building works, which form the focus of my paper today. But why did Mary choose to build? And what can her activities as an architectural patron tell us about the ways in which she conceived of and materially articulated her position and power? Similar questions have long interested scholars of France, Italy, and the Low Countries. In his paper on female regents in Renaissance France, for instance, Thomas Tolley argues that women who could act as sovereigns in their own right and ruled as regents are almost always of particular interest to the history of patronage of the visual arts. And he goes on to say that this is because their positions of authority led them to commission works on a grand scale, which often also served to project them as important players on the political stage. What then can Mary, as a Queen Dowager building in Scotland, add to this broader picture of women's architectural patronage in late medieval Europe? This evening, I'm going to address this question by considering each of Mary's building projects in turn, before drawing together some common threads and themes at the end of my talk. So first then, let's take ourselves on a virtual pilgrimage to Edinburgh to visit Trinity College Kirk. If you walk down the Royal Mile, Edinburgh Castle behind you and the sea on the horizon in front of you, you'll see many familiar landmarks. Gladstone's Lands on your left, which we can see here, St Giles Cathedral on your right, and of course, several tartan and whisky shops. When you reach the Museum of Childhood, halfway down, you might easily carry on walking straight, not even noticing Chalmers Close directly opposite, which is one of the many small streets radiating down towards Waverley Station. If you do decide to turn down Chalmers Close, however, you'll be confronted with a less than picturesque view of Jury's Inn, its budget 90s facade contrasting starkly with the picturesque shopfronts you've left behind on the Royal Mile. Yet, if you look to your right, you'll find another building which is perhaps even more unexpected given the setting, and that's part of a late medieval chantry chapel. Trinity Apse, as it's now known, once formed part of a much larger chapel and hospital, which originally stood on the site of Waverley train station. When Waverley was built, Trinity was dismantled, and the stones were numbered and placed on the nearby Regent Road, close to Carlton Hill, where they apparently stayed for a period of 24 years. The intention was to rebuild the chapel in its entirety on another site, but this never happened. In the end, only the apse ended up being rebuilt on Chalmers Close, which is the building we can see today. And if you look very closely at the stonework, you can still see some of the numbers that were carved into the stones, a bit like an IKEA flat pack designed to be put back together. Some of the decorative roof bosses have also now ended up in the National Museum of Scotland, as we'll see later on. So incomplete, out of place, and eroded by the passage of time, Trinity encapsulates many of the challenges we face when looking at women's architectural patronage during this period. But unlike some of the buildings I work on, we're fortunate that there's a building left at all. There's also a relatively detailed body of documentary evidence relating to Trinity's foundation and its development. Historic maps, antiquarian drawings, and even a very early photograph from the 1840s, which we can see here, show the building in its original location. But why did Mary commission it? The early papal bulls and the foundation charter dating from the 25th of March, 1462, notably the feast day of the Annunciation, tell us that Mary's foundation was to be dedicated to the praise and honour of the Holy Trinity, the Virgin Mary, St. Ninian the Confessor, and All Saints. The buildings were to include a perpetual college or collegiate church for 1 provost, 8 chaplains or prebendaries, and 2 choristers. Alongside this, there was also to be a hospital for 13 poor beadsmen. This perpetual chantry was intended by Mary as a way of securing masses for the souls of the royal family, including her deceased husband James, his ancestors, Mary's own ancestors from the ducal house of Gelders, and for Mary herself. Mary also wanted Trinity to be her final resting place, although when the chapel was dismantled during the 19th century, the skeleton thought to be hers was moved to the nearby chapel at Holyrood Palace. The chapel and hospital originally stood in the suburb of St. Ninians, a low-lying area of land to the north of the Burgh of Edinburgh, which was located just beyond the now vanished city gate known as Leith Wynd Port, and previous to that, St. Andrew's Port. Directly to the west of Mary's foundation was the Nor Loch, which today is the site of Princes Street Gardens. And as you can see from this close-up of the 1647 map depicting Edinburgh and Canongate, Mary's church and hospital stood either side of Leith Wynd, which was the old Roman road linking Edinburgh to the port of Leith to the northeast, where Mary had first arrived more than a decade earlier. And I should say here that the courtyard that you can see beneath the church, just here, is the prebendaries' accommodation. St. Ninians wasn't a particularly wealthy suburb, but it did have a history of attracting religious foundations and hospitals, including an earlier chapel dedicated to St. Ninian, as we might expect from the name, and also a leper house. So it's possible that the location of Mary's foundation was decided with a view to continuing a pre-existing tradition of religious and charitable activity in the area. The chapel's position next to the main road linking Edinburgh to the port of Leith also meant that it would have been regularly encountered by traders and visitors busily toing and froing from the continent. This in itself may have had particular appeal for Mary, who herself, as I've already said, had travelled from the port of Leith to Edinburgh when she first arrived in the country over a decade earlier. It's clear that Mary took a close personal interest in her foundation. Contemporary documents are authenticated with her personal seal, which we can see represented in the bottom left here. And she stipulates that a number of details, including how the prebendaries and beadsmen were expected to behave. The prebendaries were forbidden from keeping concubines or housekeepers, and it was also essential that they could read and sing. Mary instructed that after Mass, the prebendaries were to also approach her tomb to engage in further prayer. Similarly, the beadsmen were expected to exhibit exemplary behaviour and to provide and wear a uniform of blue. And I think maybe the colour was decided because of its Marian associations. The Charter concludes with the stipulation that the Queen had the right to make any amendments or additions to the rules whenever she pleased. Further evidence of Mary's role as the driving force behind her foundation is found in the later actions of her son, James III, who after his mother's death chose to sideline Mary's foundation and focus instead on the nearby collegiate church of Bresselrigg. Mary's active involvement in Trinity's commission and her choice to be buried on the outskirts of Edinburgh are revealing of the ways in which she understood her identity and sought to be remembered. Lucy Dean argues that Mary could have easily chosen to be buried at the mausoleum of her natal family in Gelders, yet instead she chose to be buried in Edinburgh. Rather than choosing Holyrood like her husband, however, Mary sought burial in a foundation of her own making. In this, she might be likened to close contemporary regents like Margaret of Austria, who chose to be buried in her monastic foundation of Bra. Laura Gelfand argues that the newly extended plan of Margaret's monastery in 1509 not only signalled her intention to remain unmarried after the death of her husband Philibert, but also shows Margaret's recognition that the regency of the Netherlands made her an individual who both deserved and could afford a suitably impressive burial site. And this is a statement that I think we could also apply to Mary. In her work on the religious patronage of aristocratic women in late medieval England, Barbara Harris has also shown that burial, including the location and the design of tombs, was an important means through which elite women defined themselves at a late life stage, serving as expressions of their choice and agency. Harris and others have also shown how the preservation of personal and familial memories was a gendered activity, with aristocratic women taking a particularly active role in keeping and curating familial lineage and status through their commission of tomb monuments, manuscripts, and other media. The exact location of Mary's tomb within the original chapel remains a matter of debate, but Thomas Tolley has made a convincing argument for its prominent location in the east of the church, behind the main altar, where it later would have been accompanied by the Trinity altarpiece, the remaining wings or side panels of which are now housed in the National Gallery of Scotland, and which you can see here. And these panels on their open side show Mary's son, James III, on the left, and his bride, Margaret of Denmark, in the company of St. Andrew and St. George. And I'm sorry about the terrible quality of these images. It's really impossible to photograph the panels in the glass cases that they're in at the moment, which date from the 1930s. And something else I should say here that you don't really get a sense of from this picture is that these panels are absolutely enormous. So you don't really get a sense of the scale, but when you go and see them, you really get the impression of just how grand Mary's foundation was. Now, the altarpiece to which these panels belonged was commissioned over a decade after Mary's death, but despite this, they do still have a link to Mary. And the clue lies in this kneeling figure with a rather fetching bowl cut, who's represented on the reverse of the panel of Margaret of Denmark. Now, this man is thought to be Edward Bonkell, a member of a wealthy Edinburgh merchant family who had strong commercial links with Bruges. Mary had appointed him as the first provost of her foundation, but following the Queen's death, he became quite unpopular in royal circles, and the evidence seems to suggest that he commissioned the altarpiece, at least in part, as a fulfilment of Mary's wishes. What's more, in his analysis of the triptych, Thomas Tolley argues that the missing central panel very likely showed the coronation of the Virgin, perhaps resembling this contemporary panel that we can see here by Dirk Bouts. If this was the case, and the altarpiece did in fact accompany the tomb of Mary of Gelders, then the close proximity of such an image to the body of the late Queen of Scots would have no doubt invited flattering parallels to be drawn between these earthly and heavenly queens, thus configuring Mary's body in Marian terms. Only the apse, choir and transepts of the collegiate church were ever completed. So sadly, the tower was never added, and this is why the building has this quite squat appearance that we see in the 19th century drawings and photographs. Despite this, though, the building is thought to have represented one of the finest examples of medieval Gothic architecture in Scotland, with over £1,000 spent on the project. In his essay on ecclesiastical architecture, Rickman describes the interior as a very beautiful decorated composition, with the capitals of the piers enriched with foliage, not exceeded in design or execution in any English cathedral. He goes on to say that the elaborate details of clustered pillars, carved bosses, corbels, and capitals of the piers combine to produce an aspect of rare architectural beauty. And some of those bosses and corbels, as I mentioned earlier, are now on display in the National Museum of Scotland. And as you can see here, some of them are actually quite playful, like the marginalia of an illuminated manuscript. And here you can see a water spout in the form of a monkey. And just for comparison, we can also see a monkey in the margins of the prayer book of Mary's mother, Catherine of Cleves. Within the church, there were also altars dedicated to Saints Margaret and Catherine with their accompanying images, and a silver-gilt monstrance, again suggesting its rich and sumptuous appearance. So what influences can we see at work on the design of Mary's foundation then? Lizzie Swarbrick has argued that the tierceron vault, bosses, and elaborate foliate carving that we can still see at Trinity apse today are particularly unusual for Scottish architecture at this time. Richard Fawcett also argues that the stones of Trinity Chapel show clear evidence of the work of Burgundian masons. Bruges was a major trading partner for Edinburgh at this point, and it's therefore possible that Mary drew on a pre-existing Flemish workforce in the city. Another possibility is that Mary requested masons from her adopted home in Burgundy. Either way, the Burgundian influences appear to have been a nod to Mary's Burgundian heritage, and perhaps more specifically, to her close links with Isabella of Portugal, in whose household she was raised. The work of Christa de Jonge and Francesca Kennedy Saltman, among others, has shown that Isabella was a prolific patron who closely supported the foundation of several religious orders and buildings, whilst also forging close political alliances with other women across Europe. Isabella's works are far too numerous to list here, but of particular relevance to my paper today are her refurbishment of the Hospital of St. Jacques in Lille, which involved rebuilding a wing for poor pilgrims on their way to Santiago de Compostela, and adding a maternity hospital for poor women. Isabella also played a key role in commemorating members of both her natal and marital kin through the commission of several magnificent tomb effigies. She was also personally involved in the preparations for Mary's wedding to James, and she sent 2 of her own ladies with the teenage bride when she departed for Scotland. While no contracts or letters survive between the 2 women, we can't rule out the possibility that the Duchess was a mentor, or at the very least, an inspiration for Mary's building activities. And I'll come back to this idea of cultural transfer through female networks when I come on to talk about Falkland Palace towards the end of my paper. The location of Mary's foundation, on the outskirts of Edinburgh, may have also been influenced by her Burgundian upbringing. Contemporary commentators from Europe stated that Scottish kings were more likely to reside in the countryside than in towns and cities. This was in contrast to other European courts, such as Burgundy, where Mary had grown up, whose rulers tended to inhabit castles and residences in towns and cities where the royal court could be directly supported by the neighbouring urban infrastructure. In the 15th century, however, we see a gradual shift, and the Scottish royal family begin to spend more and more of their time in cities including Edinburgh, Stirling and Perth. And the historian Graham Small has argued that royal foundations such as Trinity were a material expression of this fertile interaction between court and urban community, which had become so apparent by the close of the 15th century. And this increasing presence of the Scottish royal family in towns and cities is one reason, among others, why the 15th century has been described as the most Burgundian period in Scottish history. And one can't help but think that Mary had a role to play in this. Growing up at the Burgundian court, she would have witnessed the close links between its dukes and the urban community, and therefore it must have seemed only natural for her to build within an urban context. Yet despite the evidence of Burgundian influences on the design and urban siting of Mary's Chapel, it would be a misrepresentation to describe Trinity as an entirely Burgundian foundation. One of the two master masons on the project was John Haukerston, who appears to have been an Edinburgh local, and whose work can be found in St Giles Kirk, St Salvator's in St Andrews, and also in the Norman Church of Duddingston on the outskirts of Edinburgh. Rather than simply commissioning a Burgundian building in a Scottish landscape then, Mary's foundation seems to have blended the two in what we might regard as a fitting tribute to both her natal and marital heritage. Now, before moving on to Mary's domestic projects of Ravenscraig Castle and Falkland Palace, I'd like us to stay in Edinburgh for the moment to consider Mary's involvement in the building works at St Giles Kirk. And I should probably just preface this by saying that St Giles wasn't a cathedral at this point. So it first became a collegiate foundation 6 years after Mary's death, and then it went on to become a cathedral much later in 1690. But even in Mary's lifetime, it was still a centrally placed church on the main processional routeway from the castle down to Holyrood Palace. And from 1454, the Lady Chapel also held a relic of the arm bone of St Giles, which was a gift from Charles VII of France. In 1460, several changes were made to the fabric of St Giles, including the lengthening of the choir eastwards from the main altar, the heightening of the roof, and the addition of clerestory windows. These changes appear to have taken place, at least in part, at Mary's instigation. And here we can see a representation of the pillar, which is still known as the King's Pillar today. And this pillar has 4 coats of armorial bearings, those of the late King James II, those of Mary of Gelders, those denoting an heir or prince, and then the final one shows the fleur-de-lis of France. In addition to this, 2 other pillars also bear the arms of several men who were closely associated with the late king, including James Kennedy, Bishop of St Andrews, and Nicholas Otterburn, who was vicar of the church and who had been among those who had selected Mary as the king's bride some years earlier. One of the demi-pillars also shows the arms of Alexander Napier of Merchiston, who was controller of the king's household when he died. It would seem then that Mary worked alongside these men, all of whom were very close to the king, to commemorate her husband through the architectural fabric of St Giles. Further evidence for Mary's involvement in the changes to the church is evidenced by the great bell of the cathedral, which unfortunately no longer survives, but is known to have been cast in Flanders in 1460 and bore the arms of Gelderland, Mary's home province, along with the figures of the Virgin and Child. Now, very excitingly, even more evidence for Mary's involvement in the works at St Giles was brought to light last year, when Dr. Coralie Mills and Hamish Darragh carried out dendrochronology on the internal 5-storey timber frame which sits within the tower of St Giles and supports the iconic crown spire that we can see here. What Mills and Darragh found is that the frame is coeval with Mary's period as regent, and that the crown spire itself dates to between 1460 and 1467, although the spire we see today was altered quite a bit in 1653. Mills and Darragh also discovered that the timber used for the frame is in fact native to Scotland, being sourced from the royal forest of Darnaway. Now, this is significant because most of Scotland's timber supply had switched to Scandinavian resources at this point. So the use of native oak is really quite special, and again strongly hints at Mary's close involvement in the alterations to the church. So here again with St Giles, we can see Mary's enthusiasm for religious patronage and her awareness of the power of architecture as a means of personal, communal, and familial commemoration. So now then, I'd like to move on to Mary's domestic building projects, starting with Ravenscraig Castle. So at the same time as she was commissioning her foundation at Trinity and her works to St Giles, Mary was also overseeing works at Ravenscraig Castle, which is located in Kirkcaldy in Fife, and that's directly to the north of Edinburgh, just over the Queen's Ferry crossing. And here you can see the castle, which sits on a triangular promontory overlooking the Firth of Forth. And I love this image. I think it's really atmospheric, this medieval castle in the foreground, and then those enormous tower blocks behind it. Shortly before his untimely death, James gifted the estate of Dysart to Mary and instructed his Master of Works, David Boyce, who was involved in her project at Trinity, to build Mary a castle. As a widow, Mary chose to take on this project, and as far as we can tell from the Exchequer rolls, it was entirely funded from her personal revenues. We know that she spent £600 Scots on Ravenscraig, but it could have been considerably more, as the accounts for the Queen's lands for the first term after the King's death are very frustratingly missing. As with Trinity, Mary died before she could see the project finished, but during the Queen's lifetime, a great ditch was dug, the curtain walls were constructed, and the eastern drum tower was largely completed. So the royal castle was originally intended to have 2 drum towers on an east to west axis, which were to be connected via a great hall above the main entrance, a bit like Linlithgow Palace, for those of you who know it. Although it was unfinished, part of the castle was inhabitable before Mary's death, as in 1461, the Queen's steward was able to stay there for a period of 25 days, along with several of her servants. At the point of Mary's death, the regular flurry of works on the castle ceases altogether, again suggesting that Mary was very much the driving force behind the project's development. As with Trinity, Mary's son, James III, took very little interest in Ravenscraig, and after she died, he granted the castle to the Sinclair family, who were responsible for building the taller West Tower, which you can see here to the left. From the outset, Ravenscraig Castle was intended to have a strong military appearance, and here we can see just how thick the walls are. It's also believed to be the first castle in Scotland which was designed to withstand cannon fire. Now, for this reason, Ravenscraig has been regarded as something of an enigma for historians and heritage professionals, who have often considered the military design of the castle as being at odds with its supposedly intended use by Mary as a dower or retirement house. Yet the 2 interpretations are not necessarily incompatible, especially when we consider the ever-constant threat from the English at this point, and the fact that continental female regents were frequently involved in fortifying residences and towns. And the work of Stephen Bowd on Renaissance Italy has been particularly good at illuminating this. Around 100 years later, Mary, Queen of Scots' mother, Mary de Guise, also took an active interest in artillery during her 6 years as regent, visiting the sieges of Haddington and Broughty Castle during the War of Rough Wooing between England and Scotland, which took place between 1542 and 1551. Marie de Guise also fortified the island of Inchkeith, which occupies the Firth of Forth and sits midway between Edinburgh and Ravenscraig. Like Mary de Guise, Mary of Gelders had seen the effects of warfare firsthand. She had witnessed the siege of Blackness Castle, as I mentioned earlier, and she was later present at the siege of Norham in 1463. Mary's decision to fortify Ravenscraig, which occupied a vulnerable coastal position on the strategically important Firth of Forth then, perhaps doesn't seem so odd when it's viewed in this context. Additionally, we might see Mary's creation of an artillery fortress as part of a wider commemorative strategy for her husband, whose love of artillery, as I mentioned earlier, is well documented. It seems that personal and familial concerns were again in tandem rather than at odds with one another, and that Mary deployed this building project to communicate a sophisticated array of messages regarding her status as both widow and military ruler. So finally then, I'd like to move inland slightly to consider Falkland Palace, which is only around 11 miles northwest of Ravenscraig, but its position, nestled in the heart of a village, gives it a more intimate and homely feel than the former's more exposed coastal location. Now, Falkland was traditionally a hunting lodge, which later evolved into more of a Renaissance pleasure palace for Scottish royalty. And this was in large part due to its attractive landscape setting. And the structures we can see today, so this L shape here that's made up of the south wing in the foreground, and then the ruins, range to the east, largely represent the work of James V and his queen, Mary de Guise. And James and Marie de Guise really went to town on rebuilding the medieval palace in the 16th century. And they adopted this refined Italianate classicism, which we can see here, and which was very fashionable at the French court at this time. So unfortunately, Mary's earlier works at the palace no longer survive. And for this reason, we instead have to rely almost entirely on the documentary record here. That said, you can hopefully see that the stonework on the tower in the foreground changes 1/3 of the way up. And so it's possible that the 16th century apartments were adapted from the medieval palace that Mary knew and loved. And I should say here that I'm grateful to Ian Campbell for bringing this to my attention and for our discussions about Falkland. Mary's works at Falkland were more modest than those at Trinity and Ravenscraig, yet they're interesting because they cast a slightly different light on her activities as an architectural patron. Mary added to the existing buildings at Falkland through her creation of a new chamber for her own personal use, which was fitted with glass windows and a door which led directly onto a newly made garden. As part of these works, Mary also commissioned a gallery. Now, while these might all seem like quite minor changes, Mary's works on her personal living space show that she was an innovative patron in a number of ways. Glass was relatively rare in domestic buildings at this point, and it's also from Mary's period as Dowager Queen that regular references to the works on the gardens at Falkland also begin. And if you get a chance to visit when it reopens, you can still find an avenue of trees which is referred to as Gilderland to this day. The gallery at Falkland is also the earliest recorded example of this type of structure in Scotland, and its novelty is reinforced by the fact that the term is recorded in French rather than in Scots in the accounts, therefore suggesting that the word hadn't entered the vernacular at this point. On the continent, it was common for women who acted as regents or rulers to adapt their living space in order to suitably express their newfound status. Some years later, in 1531, Mary of Hungary celebrated becoming regent by building a new chamber and a 50-metre long gallery at Cowdenberg Palace in Brussels, despite her reported poverty. When Mary's great-aunt Isabella of Portugal designed her new apartments in Bruges, she also commissioned a secret gallery in the garden wall, which was attached to her personal chambers. Isabella also took the Hortus Conclusus, or the enclosed garden, as her personal emblem. And so here again, then, we may be seeing the Duchess's influence on the design and nature of Mary's building projects. So finally, to draw some conclusions then. This evening, I've sought to show how Mary of Gelders deployed the built environment to articulate her position and power as Queen Dowager during her son's minority. By looking at each of Mary's building projects in turn, from her religious patronage at Trinity and St Giles to her domestic works at Ravenscraig Castle and Falkland Palace, I've sought to show how these buildings, both on an individual and collective basis, communicated multivalent messages regarding Mary's power and status. What emerges is a rich picture of Mary as an innovative patron, an agent of cultural transfer, and a strategic user of architecture for personal and familial glorification. Through the spectrum of Mary's projects, from churches and hospitals to fortresses and palaces, we have seen how Mary carefully balanced her role as a pious widow and mother with her military and governing responsibilities as Queen Dowager. In this sense, it's evident that she was fluently conversant with architecture as a sophisticated language of female authority, a lesson she had no doubt learned from the powerful women who shaped her formative years, particularly Isabella of Portugal, Duchess of Burgundy, who I've mentioned frequently throughout my paper. Finally then, I hope I've shown that Mary is more than deserving of a place within a broader European narrative of female architectural patronage, in which Scottish women, or in this case, a woman in Scotland, have long remained in the shadows. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much indeed, Rachel, for that. Varied and extremely interesting talk about Mary of Gelders and her architectural patronage. Not often we have a talk that, well, not often we have a sort of Scottish stroke continental talk, but also not often we have one that combines the patronage of ecclesiastical and and domestic architecture, and military architecture, if you like, so sort of evenly. So I'm sure there'll be lots of questions and comments, and I can see that one has come into the Q&A already. I wonder, just while other people are adding their questions, there's another one, good. If I can use Chair's privilege to ask you a question. Ravenscraig is interesting, obviously for lots of reasons. Do you think it's possible that Mary's personality isn't really reflected at all in Ravenscraig, and that the money for it came from her income for some less interesting reason that we just can't see? I wonder, and sometimes worry about how quickly scholars are, including myself, I hasten to add, to ascribe sort of to map personality onto patronage, if you see what I mean. Patronage is quite often, or seems to me quite often, not to be as interesting as we'd like it to be. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks. That's an interesting question. I don't know. I think I disagree. Just because she chose to continue that, she could have put her attention elsewhere. And I think we do have a tendency to think that female patrons are more interested in sort of non-military commissions. So, you know, religious chapels and palaces. So maybe Falkland and Trinity and St Giles seem more in keeping with what we expect. But I think her position, I mean, we don't know whether she was a regent. It's a bit complicated, but she essentially holds the powers of being a regent. So apart from being a regent in name, she is essentially. And, you know, in that role, she would have to combine what we might regard as both masculine and feminine elements. And I think in that way, Ravenscraig represents that other dimension. And that's why I brought in the comparison with Mary de Guise, who also is very interested in artillery and who's also involved in, you know, fortifying Inchkeith Island. So I guess I want to take a more positive and less pessimistic view. Say that we are getting a representation of her personality through these projects.
Yeah, I hope I wasn't being pessimistic. I was just searching for, you know, rather reluctantly searching for possible alternatives to this very attractive biographical account, not just yours, but I'm thinking about others to do with other buildings elsewhere. I mean, she may, for example, have had some sort of obligation we don't know about to finish building the thing. But in any case, I think we better go to the questions and answers, and we can come back to that.
Can I just say that I
yes,
think that's often
captious. No, sorry.
Sorry. I just wanted to say that I think it's often the case when we talk about female patrons, we're quite nervous about attributing agency to them. And we don't do that when we talk about male patrons. We automatically say this person built that castle, and we don't put that element of doubt. So I think sometimes we have to be a bit bolder.
Yes, quite. That point's well taken. Okay, so Ian McInnes has asked, is it possible to trace similar patterns of architectural patronage as the Queen's among Scottish noblewomen, or is the evidence simply not there to allow this?
I'm afraid I don't know is the answer to that, but I would love to find out more. One example that I can think of off the top of my head is the widows who found the monastery on the outskirts of Edinburgh after the Battle of Flodden. So the war widows, there are a group of them who are involved in founding Sheen, I think it's Sheen Monastery, which is just to the south of the Meadows. But yeah, it would be amazing to find out more, and I'm sure there are people working on this. I know Morven French at Historic Environment Scotland is doing a great job of bringing more women's stories to light through Historic Environment Scotland's various properties. So yeah, hopefully watch this space.
Yes, and it can of course be said, as you did say, Rachel, that a lot of patronage is exercised by women anyway, because their husbands are either away or their husbands are dead, and so they're exercising this patronage all the time. And you know, we think of it with reference to tombs and books, but of course it goes on with architecture as well.
There is also the Magdalene Chapel on Cowgate as well, which was continued by Michael McQueen's widow Janet Rhinds. And her tomb, it's much altered, like it's been altered a great deal in subsequent centuries, but her tomb can still be found next to what was originally the main altar. Unfortunately, it's under a carpeted slab, so you have to look quite hard to find it. But yeah, that's another example of a townswoman, so a woman who was elite in a different context, being involved in building in Edinburgh.
Thank you. Richard Asketh asks, or says, thank you for a fascinating talk, Rachel. Did Mary's patronage of architecture extend beyond her death? Does her will or the work of her executors demonstrate similar themes to those you have identified during her life?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Well, it's very frustrating, really. Trinity does extend beyond her death. And obviously I mentioned Edward Bunkle, who was appointed as provost of her foundation. And he, as I said, was very unpopular in royal circles, but he held in there. And we think that, you know, he was involved in fulfilling Mary's wishes. So that personal relationship between the two of them carried through. But really, with the other projects, we see quite a shift, quite a sharp change in emphasis. James III, as I said, really doesn't take much interest in his mother's foundations. He's more interested in his own collegiate chapel at Wresselrig, Ravenscraig Castle as well. He passes that on to the Sinclair family. So yeah, unfortunately, the projects aren't really continued in the way that I imagine Mary would have wanted them to have been.
Yes, we have this fascinating set of statutes for Holy Trinity, don't we? And does that tell us very much? That presumably tells us a lot about what she wanted.
Yeah, it does. And I mean, that's mostly what I outlined in the paper.
Yeah.
But obviously things do change. The religious climate changes as well. The hospital does stay in use in various forms afterwards, but I haven't really delved into the later history as much.
No. Okay. Well, following on from that response, Lindy Grant says, "Thank you for a fascinating and rich paper, Rachel, but what went wrong in her relationship with her son after death, which led him to lose interest in her buildings?"
I don't know. We don't seem to see their relationship as particularly antagonistic, but I think maybe it's a case of him wanting to assert himself as king and step out of his mother's shadow, really. So I don't really see it as an act of sort of anger or active defiance, but there is a sense of him wanting to carve his own identity through his patronage. And again, that's why I think Mary's very much the driving force behind these projects. I think that the key is there, the fact that he doesn't pick them up and carry them on. So she's not really doing it on his behalf. She's doing it for her.
Yes, yes. Okay, Philip Lancaster says, "You mentioned a body found at Trinity College, which was thought to be Mary's. Were any traces of a tomb or even a tomb slab found?"
Yeah, so interestingly, there were two female bodies that were dug up when the chapel was demolished, and one of them was thought to be Mary of Gelders, and there was, as far as I can remember, some sort of damage to the skull. You might remember this better than I do, Julian. But that was said to be a sign of Mary's sort of inferiority and her female weakness as well. So this was a really strong theme in the early historiography. They tried to sort of discredit her and say that she didn't have all her marbles, basically, and that the skeleton was proof of this. But more recent literature suggests that this wasn't Mary's body at all. So the literature is quite confused here. And as far as I know, I haven't seen details about what the tomb looked like. Obviously, Thomas Tolley has inferred that the Trinity altarpiece was later meant to accompany the tomb. And as I said, that's enormous, and it's a really sort of grand monument. And this image of the coronation of the Virgin at the centre would have obviously drawn flattering parallels between image and tomb. But no, I'm afraid I don't know very much, or we don't know very much about what the tomb itself looked like.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this altarpiece, sure, this is a high altarpiece. It's got, if you're right about, and other people are right about this central subject and the lost central subject and the corresponding to the dedication of the chapel, these Scots churches having these big reticles, these big painted reticles, imported reticles, rather than having the sorts of sculpted reredos we get in England. Just seems to me eminently likely that maybe her tomb is in the founder's position. Anyway, yeah, who knows really. Another question's coming. Good. Okay, so yeah, this is Anna. Thank you for a wonderful paper, Anna Bowles-Rowland, for everybody who doesn't know her. Thank you for a wonderful paper. Do you know if the decoration of these buildings also included furnishings from the Burgundian Low Countries, tapestries or cloth, etc.?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. That's a great question. I'm afraid not really. We have very limited details about the furnishings. So most of the details we have are about the architectural fabric and the use of the buildings. And as I mentioned, we know that there were altars dedicated to St. Margaret and St. Catherine in Trinity, and that it had this beautiful silver gilt monstrance. But apart from the monstrance and the Trinity altarpiece, there's not really any other evidence of sort of tapestries or other material remains. But obviously we can imagine, I mean, the photos I showed of Trinity Apse today look very sort of grim and grey. I went in there on a particularly grey November day. But originally we can imagine that it would have been painted and that it would have been a very colourful building with stained glass windows as well. So we've lost all of that, unfortunately.
Yeah. At the risk of talking too much, I'd just say that the default assumption has to be that in a royal foundation like this in Edinburgh in the 15th century, that it's full of Netherlandish stuff.
Yeah.
You know, that the canon's stalls, like the altarpiece and all sorts of other bits and pieces, is made, whether imported from Bruges, which is actually closer to Edinburgh than London by sea, and also politically more palatable. And there's a larger Scots mercantile presence there. And, you know, so, yeah, I mean, it has to be the case, one would want to say. I'm not sure, do you think the local artists, this is a great problem for people who are interested, like, you know, in Scottish stuff. Do you think the local artists are sort of up to it? We can't know, but it doesn't seem that they would have been fitting out a royal chapel like this.
Yeah, although with the Masons, I guess we see a blend with John Halkerston and then the Burgundian Masons as well. So,
yeah.
So maybe even if they were few and far between, maybe we do have a few Scottish artists involved.
The Masons, sure. That's okay. There's a few more questions in now, so I can turn back to them. Karen Dempsey. Hi, Rachel. Thanks for an interesting paper. What do you see as the biggest challenge to exploring female patronage apart from source issues? Sorry, my eyesight's not as good as it used to be. Where would you like to see castle studies or architectural histories moving in the future?
Thanks, Karen. A great and a big question. So yeah, the sources are the obvious one, the frustrations that we both know well. I think, as I said earlier, I think it's just being a little bit bolder sometimes. And that's not to say that we need to use our imagination, but I think informed speculation. I think we're very hesitant often when we're talking about female patrons. And I've definitely experienced this when I've been giving papers. And I've talked about building accounts that are, you know, signed off in the Queen's or the woman's name. And someone's put their hand up and said, well, how do we know it was her? How do we know it wasn't, you know, the Mason in charge that was making these decisions? And okay, that's a legitimate question, but we don't ask that when we're talking about male patrons, or at least we don't ask it as often. So either we need to be asking it of both, or we need to not ask it of the women. So I think in terms of questions and of using informed speculation, I think that's an important way in which we can move forward with castle studies. And then there was a second part to that question, wasn't there?
Yeah, the second part was, where would you like to see castle studies moving in the future? Yeah, that is it. So
so I mean, I would just like to see multiple narratives told at castle sites, you know, from the women at the highest social levels right down to the laundresses, to the servants' experiences, to the children's experiences, to what it was like for people coming in from outside, all those sorts of things. And I mean, that is happening more and more. I know Will Wyeth at English Heritage was involved in recurating Richmond Castle in Yorkshire recently. And that's got some great panels on the structure of the great household. And they came across a record of a woman called Emena, who was the keeper of the Earl's hawks and hounds. So a position that we don't traditionally associate with women. But there she was in the documentary record, and she's now got her own panel in that interpretation. So giving people sort of multiple options to explore different stories, and to also do that through objects as well. You know, archaeology at these sites is often really exciting. So to be able to tell multiple narratives through maybe single objects is something that I know is happening already, but I think it's an exciting way forward.
Thank you. Abigail Van Slyke asks, she says, thank you for a fine talk. The 1815 ground plans of the Holy Trinity were fascinating. To what extent do they show the building that Mary built, as opposed to later changes? Could they be used to explore architecture's role in reinforcing Mary's expectations for the behaviour of the inhabitants?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So obviously Mary was only regent or essentially regent for 3 years. So it's a very short space of time. It's the same length as my fellowship at the moment. I'm realizing how much she managed to get done in such a short space of time. So only the chancel was completed during her lifetime. So again, you know, we're a bit unsure as to how the later developments relate to her plans for her foundation. But she is very assertive in the charter about the role she expected the prebendaries and the beadsmen to play. And, you know, architecture would have reflected that as well, that sort of that communal living space, and the way it was laid out, that would have echoed her expectations. So it's a bit of both, really. I think it sort of continues in some ways along the same lines, but obviously later changes and later personalities are involved in adapting and changing that building. And then, of course, the Victorians moved what they thought was her body out of that chapel altogether and moved it to Holyrood. So that changes the curation of her memory altogether.
Yes, thank you very much. Lucinda Dean, thank you, Rachel, for a splendid paper. Thinking on James III, not continuing Mary's work, he was still only 11-ish when she died. So it would be other, quote unquote, other men in power that changed the direction rather than James III himself initially. So his age could be an issue here, and it could be more about the men in power seeking to move away from Mary's influence on her son. Or could it, this is a question actually, I've misread it, or could it be more about the men in power seeking to move away from Mary's influence on her son rather than James himself? More of a comment than a question, really, but perhaps you've got something you'd like to say about it.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you, Lucy. I agree with that. I think I often forget how young James was when she died, and I think that's true. And a lot of men, I know she had a rivalry with Bishop Kennedy in particular, saw her as a bit of a threat, as a powerful woman. So yeah, maybe they were responsible for taking it in a different direction, and maybe it wasn't really James at all. That's a really interesting point. Thank you.
Okay, and Christopher Curry asks, and mate, you should respond to this, Rachel. So, yeah, great talk. Sorry, I missed a point about the Trinity Chapel. Was it suggested that the Tiercéron vault reflected Burgundian influence, or just the bosses?
I think it's at the Tiercéron vault as well. Yeah, there and the corbels too as well. Looking at Richard Fawcett's work, and Lizzie Swarbrick has talked about this as well in her thesis. She gave a wonderful tour of the apse actually at the Trinity Symposium a couple of weeks ago. So yes, there's a sense that multiple aspects of the foundation are Burgundian inspired. But as I said, it's not wholly Burgundian. It's not like a Burgundian building in a Scottish landscape, but it sort of blends elements of the two.
Yes, thank you. At the moment, we don't have any more questions. Yes, another one's coming. Look, good. Virginia Johnson says, a nicely stimulating talk. The person who questioned patronage and said, how does one know Mary / a patron was responsible, is taking a modernist view that Masons are responsible. It could have been me. It seems to me that one needs to show evidence for either point of view and not assume that one and not the other is the default position.
I guess there's something to be said there about the celebrity of the architect that we think of today. You know, like later houses like the Queen's House at Greenwich and Inigo Jones, and you know, the architect being this big sort of celebrity figure, and that's just not the case in the Middle Ages. So I guess there is something to be said there for that.
Yeah. What I would say is that we always need to question patronage narratives, because they have a habit of just getting entrenched, and people don't tend to question them. And it doesn't so much matter about gendering it, although I completely take your point that people are more likely to ask questions about castle patronage, you know, if a woman is, but very often male patrons' agency should be questioned as well, simply because, not because it's necessarily wrong, traditional views are necessarily wrong, but because fruitful things come out of this questioning, or very often emerge from this questioning. It's just a way of being curious, really, and thinking around problems. Oh, there's another question. Good. Oh, yes. No, it's Virginia again saying, right on. There you go. That's
Thanks, Virginia.
endorsement, Rachel. Well, no more questions have come in, and I think that given all of the effort you put into presenting this wonderful talk, Rachel, that we should let you go with our great thanks for rounding out our series of lectures for this year in a late medieval way, and also an architectural way, and a patronage angle that we're not actually all that used to dealing with in this series of lectures, at least. So it was a fascinating talk, and I thank you very much for it. To everybody here, I would say thank you for attending. It's been a pleasure to host these lectures this year. We've discovered that doing them online has generated things, you know, interest and attendance that we wouldn't normally get at the Antiquaries. This doesn't mean that we're going to change the format in the future. There's thought going into this. I mean, permanently change the format. But it does mean that the experiment was not the disaster that some of us thought it might be. Particularly Luddites like me thought that it would be when we were first forced to put the lectures online. It's been a great success, and you know, Rachel's lectures reflected very nicely all of the virtues of doing these lectures online. So this is the last lecture before summer. There'll be another, the first one in the next series will be in October, and a program will go out to BAA members and onto the BAA website, so it's publicly accessible sometime during the summer. I can't tell you who's lecturing in October or what their title is, but I know that that program has been resolved and decided. Okay, so we'll look forward to seeing people again in the new year. And thank you again, Rachel.
Thanks, Julian, and thanks everyone for coming.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.